Good afternoon. Today is October 11th, 2021. My name is Frank Farmer, and we're here today as part of the Veterans History Project. And with that background, we have today as our guest Brigadier General Ernest Audino. General Audino is a graduate of the Military Academy at West Point, graduated in 1983, served on active duty until 2011 when he retired. Today, he presently is the district director for Congressman Michael Waltz of Florida Congressional District 6. General Audino also holds several other degrees besides his bachelor degree from West Point. He has a Master of Law and a jurisprudence doctorate from Vermont School of Law. He also holds a master's degree in national security and strategic studies at the United States National War College. So with that background, let me welcome General Audino. General Audino,
Thanks,
thank
Rick.
you very much for coming here, taking the time, and let me thank you in advance for years of service to this country. Thank you for
thank you for
a lot of sacrifice. Today we're going to talk mainly about your experience as an advisor and commanding a group of advisors to the Kurdish forces after the Iraq War of 2003. Of course, in 2003, the United States went into Iraq, deposed Saddam Hussein, who was later arrested and tried by the Iraqi forces. But after that, the Iraqi army was essentially disassembled and put back together, for want of a better term, as a democratic Iraqi army. And of course, the American advisors would play a big role in advising this. And you played a huge role in that. But before we get to your role as an advisor and the story of the Kurds, General, could you tell us a little bit? You graduated in 1983. You go over to Iraq. It's really 2005, 2006, I think. So you've already spent a considerable amount of time in the military. So briefly tell us what your training was in the military. What was your MOS and MOSs during those years leading up to your participation in Iraq?
Well, when I got commissioned as an armor officer. And I had entered West Point on July 2nd, 1979. And those 4 years, of course, you're tight with your classmates and you share a lot together. And on the evening in our final year, where the seniors, the firsties, are allowed to express their preferences for what branches they wanted to go. The academy hands them a dream sheet. And as I recall, there were, I think, 17 branches that we could choose from. And my roommate and I, we literally took out a black magic marker and we crossed off 15 of them because there were only 2 that we were interested in. Infantry and armor. And we debated this back and forth. If you're going to be in the Army, we thought we should be able to pull a trigger. And that's why we went to the academy. And darn it, that's what we wanted to do when we graduated. And I ended up picking armor because I wanted to get up on the East German border. And he picked infantry. And then, we went on to full careers after that. But the reason why I went to West Point was at a very early age, at 10 years old, I knew I wanted to go. And my family had taken it. We grew up on I grew up on Cape Cod, but we had some family in New York, upstate New York, and my parents wanted to go visit them one weekend. We headed out there, and they happened to be in Highland Falls. I didn't know Highland Falls from New York City, as a little kid, but it was up in the mountains, upstate New York. But it was right next to this place called West Point, and we did a picnic at Trophy Point. And, there's 100 cannons lined up over there, captured in Spanish-American War, as I recall. Anyway, I'm a 10-year-old kid. I'm looking at all these cannons. I'd never been this close to a cannon before. And then these students, they're carrying rifles. Yeah, I think this is a school I want to go to. So that was the spark. And, of course, over the years, as I learned more about West Point, I kind of formalized my preparation for it.
Now, how old were you at that time when you made that decision that you
10.
wanted to go?
I was
You were 10 years old.
10 years old.
And so I assume that you tailored your school courses to getting into West Point, and I assume you made pretty good grades because the selection process for West Point is pretty competitive.
Yeah, I had good grades. Had a lot of math, science, and physics types classes. But I took all the classes and played a lot of sports because you've got to be, you got to have good grades, but you also have to have good athletics and a robust extracurricular activity. Because on the battlefield, it's as you well know, Frank, it's high tempo, it's great stakes. You rarely have sufficient information. The situation is vague, lots of moving parts, and so the academy looks for people who can excel in an environment of great complexity. So having just good grades is good. Having good grades and doing all these other things and excelling in those other activities, very important.
And during your stay at West Point, what was your impression of West Point overall as far as the preparation, the academic preparation, and the military preparation?
I've said this to others before. I wasn't surprised at anything because I had focused on it for so long that when I got there, and this is hard to believe, nothing surprised me.
Now, an entering class, how many people were in your entering class?
1,460.
And how many out of that 1,460 graduated?
1,450. 860 graduated.
And the rest were either left voluntarily or left for academic reasons or
conduct.
That's pretty much a 50% attrition rate. That's a pretty high attrition rate.
Well, you've got to feel the calling. It's not something you do casually. It's not a decision you make casually.
And when you did graduate, as you said, you went into the armored branch. You also have 101st Airborne. Is that 101st Airborne pin I see on you? So you went to jump school also?
Jump school, yeah.
And what other? So in 1983, and until the first Gulf War. The first Gulf War was 91, I think. Did you participate in the first Gulf War?
No, I had gone back to school at that point. So I'd left the unit, gone back to school, and I wasn't available at that time to go
Now,
when the balloon went up.
All right. So you stayed in there. You were advancing rank here. You'd been in the Army for over 20 years when you were assigned as an advisor to the Iraqi Army. What was your rank when you went over to Iraq?
I was colonel, full colonel.
Full bird colonel. And when did you get your orders? When did you know you were going over to Iraq, and what were you told your assignment and duties were going to be?
Well, I was in the Pentagon at the time, and as I recall, my boss came by and said, "Hey, Ernie, you're going," and we were all very similar to back when we were at West Point during the Iranian hostage crisis. We wanted to go. There were some asses that needed to be kicked and names that needed to be taken, and young guys want to go and do that, and we feel that duty.
Sure.
It's duty calling. So when I got that word, I was excited that I was going to get into the mix, and then I learned it was going to be on an advisor team. And at the time, the Army had stood up a bunch of advisor teams because very similar, built and organized very similar to Special Forces teams. But the Special Forces were out of Schlitz at this point. We had operations going on all over the world. They needed more capacity for advising missions. And so, they formed these teams. They were 10 or 11-man teams. And we had about two and a half months of train up here in the United States. And we thought we were going to Baghdad. But our final destination wasn't confirmed. All through our train up, we thought we were going to Baghdad, probably going to link up with the 9th Iraqi Division, which was a heavy division. And but something wasn't quite matching up. It wasn't until we finished our stateside train up, we deployed to Kuwait. We landed in Kuwait. And we spent a week at Camp Virginia, way out in the middle of the desert. There was nothing out there, and that was for a week of acclimatization and acculturation to get ready. And we'd finished our week of training, and the next day we were going into Baghdad. So the real deal was starting within 24 hours for us. And we're in our tent, my own team, and we had 3 other teams associated with us. But my own team, we're in our tent, and we're loading ammo because the next day we're going over the border. So we're sitting on our bunks loading ammo, and I remember this major who was stationed at Camp Virginia. He fights his way through the tent flaps in our tent, gets inside, and I remember he was wearing a boonie cap, and a desert camouflage boonie cap, and it definitely needed an oil change. It was a filthy cap. But he fights his way in, and he says, "Sir, we've confirmed your final destination." And I'm like, "All right, not a moment too soon." He's got a typical Army, yellow Army message form in his hand, and he reads off the name of this town. And all the guys stop. It's like silent. They've been waiting to hear this for 2.5 months. He reads it off, and he looks at me, and I said, "Bullshit. I don't believe it." And I said, "Why don't you go back, no offense, but why don't you go back and ask him to spell that?" And yes, sir, all right, good idea. So he battles back through the tent flaps, and I turned to the guys and said, "Guys, if that major's right, you just won the lottery." And they're like, "What do you mean, sir?" I said, "That's Kurdistan. Slimani, that's the heart of Kurdistan." And they're like, "Yeah, well, it's still Iraq." I'm like, "But you don't understand. That is the most peaceful, beautiful piece of Iraq. It's up in the mountains. The Kurds love Americans." And they're looking at me, "Well, yeah, but it's still Iraq." But, when you speak to soldiers, sometimes you have to connect and,
Yeah.
So I said, "Well, the Kurdish ladies, they're not veiled, and they've got long, beautiful hair and typically dress in Western clothes." And the guys are like, "We're in."
Now, you said you had about 2.5 months of training before you deployed to Iraq. Was that training specifically for advisory duty?
Oh, yeah.
So you knew, well, did they, as you went through your training, did you have language training, or what was the advisory training like?
Well, it was straight out of the Special Forces Advisor's Handbook. And as I recall, that book was about field manual, about 270 pages or so. And it was all structured around that, and with a dash of counterinsurgency thrown in. Because our mission, the mission for all of these teams, and this was the main effort at this time for the United States, for the war effort, the mission was specifically to develop credible Iraqi security forces capable of conducting independent counterinsurgency operations, and we advisors were to serve as their link to U.S. effects.
Now, when you went over there, what did you heard about the Iraqi forces that you were going to advise? Well, I mean, not the Kurds specifically, because when you went over, you didn't, as you pointed out, you didn't know you were going to end up in Kurdistan or with Kurd forces. You were going to be with the Iraqi army, the reconstituted Iraqi army. Yeah. What was your opinion, or what was your knowledge of the Iraqi army that was being formed, for want of a better term, the Democratic Iraqi Army?
Well, I knew that they were deeply infiltrated by enemy. In fact, I had called one of my old sergeants major when I was commanding 133 Armor, which ironically was the first unit I was ever in. I went back and commanded it. And I called him and said, "Hey," I said, "Neil, I'm heading over to the sandbox." He goes, "What's your assignment?" I told him. I'll never forget, on the other side of the phone was a long pause, and he goes, "Sir, you're going to be fighting." Because he knew it was embedded with the Iraqi forces, and they were, deeply infiltrated by enemy. But as it turned out, I ended up with the Kurds, and they are not. They are absolutely the most solid and loyal allies we have over there.
Well, when you found out that you were going to that area, if you explain, you knew something about the Kurds because You explained to your troops where they were going and what they were going to be. What did you know about the Kurds before you were sent over there and before you joined them?
I probably knew more than most Americans at that point, because when I got to the National War College before I had deployed, we had 200 classmates, 220 additional classmates. 20 additional were foreign classmates, many from Middle Eastern countries. But out of the 220, only 8 of us chose to concentrate in Islam in the Middle East. And I was quite surprised at this. At this point in time, this was right after 9/11, so I was there from 2002 to 2003, and only 8 of us chose to concentrate in Islam in the Middle East. I was shocked by that. But nevertheless, I was there to get a good education. And one of my professors was a guy by the name of Ambassador Peter Galbraith. Now, Peter had been ambassador to Croatia, but prior to that, years prior, back in the 80s, mid-80s, he was a staffer in the Senate, and I think on a Foreign Relations Committee, I believe. Nevertheless, in that capacity, he found a way to sneak into Iraq when Saddam Hussein gassed Halabja, the largest chemical strike against civilians. 5,000 Kurds died that day. Maybe 20,000 were maimed. And Saddam hit them with nerve agents, blister agents, and blood agents, and possibly some toxins. And I've got all kinds of stories about that from my time there. I lived about 25 minutes from Halabja in a safe house. But anyway, Peter had snuck in. He brought some world attention to Halabja, and he had gone on to become a Kurdish scholar in his own right. Well, he's my professor. And it was his example that inspired me to really refine my concentration onto Kurdish history and culture. And I was so fascinated by this that I continued my study afterwards. And as I like to say, that the Army assigned me, that the Army embedded me in the Kurdish forces is against all Army logic. They should have sent me to Korea, for crying out loud. It begins with the same letter, right? But
well, not many people that are watching this are going to know a whole lot about the Kurds. So tell us a little something about the Kurds. You've already pointed out in your remarks that the Kurds and Saddam Hussein did not get along very well. But the Kurds were not only in Iraq. They were from other. Tell us where the Kurds, where they live,
Sure.
and tell us a little something about their ethnicity. Tell us a little something about their religion, so the people watching this can get a sense of who the Kurds are.
yeah, well, first, they're our best allies over there. There's no question of that. Second, the Kurds, they're probably about 7, maybe 8 million in northern Iraq, probably 3 million in Syria, maybe 4 or 5 million in Iran, and about 20 million in southeastern Turkey. So they were split across those countries. Now, like all the other countries, at the signing of the Treaty of, they all were promised their own countries, and but the Kurds had an asterisk. Kurdistan had
That
an
was
asterisk.
after World War One.
Yeah. So, but after the Kurds, after the name of the nation Kurdistan, there functionally was an asterisk. There was fine print, and it essentially said, but as to a nation of Kurdistan, that has to be approved by Turkey. Well, Turkey was never going to approve that, and at the Treaty of Lausanne, Turkey fundamentally rejected that. So the Kurds never coalesced into their own nation.
So the Kurds lived in parts of Turkey, lived in parts of Syria, parts of Iraq, parts of Iran, and plus some other countries around there. They thought they were going to have their own country after World War One, but it never happened.
Never happened.
And the countries they live in, generally, as I understand it, they didn't like the Kurds very
No,
much.
no.
As a matter of fact, Turkey has designated the Kurds as terrorists, have they not? In some cases.
They have, yeah.
And tell us why that. Tell us why that is.
Well, yeah. So I'm trying to say this delicately. So there was an Armenian genocide inside Turkey, and there is an ongoing genocide, let's say, against the Kurds. There has been.
And again, that was around World War I or around that
The
period of time.
Armenian one, yeah, but it was just after that, as I recall. But the Kurds have been undergoing very similar repression ever since. If you recall Ataturk, he had the saying, "Happy is he who calls himself a Turk." Well, what happens if you're an Armenian or a Kurd? Do you stop calling yourself an Armenian? You stop calling yourself a Kurd? Well, no. Well, they've suffered the consequences, of course, because they've tried to maintain their ethnic identity, and that was absolutely crushed by the Turkish regimes, successive Turkish regimes. Continues to this day. But anyway, in late 70s, early 80s, I think, early 80s, a group, some Kurds formed a group called the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party. And they consider themselves freedom fighters, and they have been conducting operations against the Turkish military ever since. And hence, they are now designated terrorists. We've designated them for a terrorist organization as well.
Is that right?
Yeah.
What religion primarily are the Kurds?
Well, they are primarily Sunni Muslim, which is one branch of Islam. But as my Kurdish friends have told me many times, and this is them saying this now. They would say, "Brother, we weren't always Muslim. We were forced to be Muslim." And their original religion was Zoroastrian, or perhaps some of the predecessors to Zoroastrianism. And there's a very deep religion that the scholars would call the cult of angels. And I don't think they really know the name of it, but it's referred to as the cult of angels. But many of the similar beliefs and theologies, you can see the same themes in Zoroastrianism. Anyway, if you look at the Kurdish flag, and we had one around here somewhere, there's a 21-pointed star on that flag. And the Zoroastrians are, considered to be the worshipers of light. And 21 is an important number in Zoroastrianism, as it is in some of those predecessor religions. And so is 7, and so is 3. That's a 21-pointed star. And that is a link to their Zoroastrian past. So I lived with Kurds who were mainly Sunni Muslim. There were some Shia Kurds, and they were along the Iranian border, naturally. There were some Christian Kurds. And
Not very many, I assume.
yeah, there are a fair number up
Really?
near Erbil. Yeah.
Really?
Well, I was probably one of the only Americans in Iraq who could go to church in town. I went to church in town by myself. Well, I brought an interpreter, and the first day I went in there, it was a Chaldean Catholic church. I went in, I got all my gear on and weapons and everything, but it's in Kurdistan, and I walked in, and it was exactly like a Catholic Mass anywhere else I've been in the world that I've gone to. And they were speaking in Kurdish, and then when they got to the sermon, the priest switched to Aramaic, the language of Jesus. And the language scholars will tell you that the Aramaic spoken in the Kurdish region of Iraq is the purest form spoken today. 75% the same vocabulary as the time of Jesus. So I turned to my interpreter, who was a Sunni Muslim Kurd, and I whispered to him, I said, "If you don't speak Aramaic, I'm firing you."
Did he speak? I'm sure he spoke.
No, he didn't speak it.
Now, when you got your orders and to go be with the Kurds, and you've already explained where your area of operations were, but you, as a full colonel, you commanded a group of advisors. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? How many advisors did you command?
Originally we had 4 teams, my team and 3 others, and we were to cover down an entire Kurdish Peshmerga brigade, 3,300 people. But as craziness occurs within the bureaucracy of the U.S. Army. Over time, I lost my 3 teams. They pulled one out for something else, and another over here, and another over here, and ultimately it was just my 10 guys, and we covered down on 3,300 Peshmerga.
Now, during your time, how long did you spend over in Iraq with the Kurds?
Full year.
A full year? Mm-hmm. During that period of time, did you lose any of American advisors?
No, not from my team.
Okay.
But we lost 22 Kurds and 60 wounded.
So that was a pretty busy, in a military sense, things going on up there.
Well, '06 was the most violent year of that war because the surge went in partway through '07, right after I had departed. So there was the greatest volume of violence in '06. It began to peak in the early months of '07. Then the surge went in, and then it trailed right on.
Now, when after the Iraqi War, after the Iraqi force had been disassembled and put back together again, who were the enemy? Who were the Iraqi forces, the Kurd forces? Who were they fighting? Who were the opponents of them?
Well, generally they were a mix. We had a mix of jihadi groups, and there were, of course, Iranian interests mixed in as well, who were Shia. They had their own agendas. We were dealing with a lot of the Al-Qaeda offshoots, and we also happened to have to deal with the Shia, the Iranian infiltration. It was a very clever infiltration into Iraq, and frankly, many have gone on to call it a Lebanese model, where Iran very deliberately but very tenaciously and surreptitiously begins to infiltrate people and resources into a neighboring country. They begin to co-opt that country, the leadership. They begin to take over the ministries. They begin to take over the cadre of the military. They begin to take over hospitals and police forces, and they've done that to Lebanon, as you well know. It's the Lebanese model. They did it to Iraq. So we were experiencing infiltration from a group called the Jaish al-Mahdi. We called them the JAM, and they were infiltrating into a town called Tuz Khurmatu, which was on the southeastern corner of the Kurdish region of Iraq, near to the Iranian border. And it was a pretty strategic piece of terrain. It was a key piece of terrain because from Tuz Khurmatu there were 3 key roads. One ran due west like an arrow across these badlands of desert, almost uninhabited, straight to Tikrit. One ran straight down to Baghdad, and these are roads that have existed for thousands of years. And the other ran northwest into the heart of Kurdistan, which is Kirkuk. So the Iranians are definitely intent on consolidating control over Iraq. Today we see them, they have consolidated control over Iraq. They've now extended their control into Syria, and they now, for the first time since the Persian Empire, they have meaningful military presence on the shores of the Mediterranean and against the border with their Hezbollah allies in Lebanon. This is a great strategic victory for Iran. But anyway, Tuz Khurmatu sat at this crossroads, and a blind man could see it from a mile away that the Iranians were very interested in slowly gaining control. And we had an argument, let's say, with the 101st Airborne. Teams like mine weren't trusted because we were embedded with we weren't trusted by the conventional guys because we were embedded with the indigenous guys, and they frequently accused us of going native. Not the Queen's English. I told them, "You're paying me to go native," but nevertheless, we were advising that we needed to gain control of Tuz and to bring my brigade in there, at least a battalion. And my 2nd battalion, Fojidu in Kurdish, which was based in Chamchamal, 750 guys. 200 of them grew up in twos. Do you think they would know who these strangers are sneaking into town? Better than any Americans would. But the time the 101st had a plan that they wanted to build multi-ethnic units and put them in Kirkuk and put them in twos. And the division commander was briefing me on this. You know, he's socializing this plan with me because I was supposed to take it back to my counterpart. And he said, yeah, we want to put Kurdish companies under Arab command and Arab companies under Kurdish command and put them in twos. Now, this is an area that had experienced ethnic cleansing under Saddam Hussein. Okay? And I said, and it's historically Kurdish. And I said, sir, I'm going to remind you, they don't speak the same language. And he said, well, they're just going to have to get past that. And I said, but sir, they don't want to. That's the thing. And you want to bring Arabs in. Okay, so the Arabs haven't been back since the Green Line was established, and Operation Northern Watch forced Saddam Hussein off the backs of the Kurds. So you want to bring Kurds back. I mean, you want to bring Arab units back who don't even live there, who will be as foreign as we Americans. Just put my 2nd Battalion there. They know who these guys are coming in. So we had a long simmering argument over twos. Ultimately, nothing got done in twos.
So the Iranians put a lot of money into it, put a lot of resources into it, and it sounds like they were fairly successful in the plans that they had.
That was the first town that went down to the Iranian proxies in 2017 when the Iranian proxies surged in, and they seized. First thing they did was they seized twos, and then they headed northwest straight into Kirkuk. And now they've begun. If you go to Kirkuk now, they've started changing the road signs, the names of buildings. They've got an Iranian proxy cadre throughout Kirkuk.
Well, we'll get to that in a little bit because I'd like to ask about what's happening to the Kurds today. But before we get to that, let me, you painted a picture which I knew. I'm not sure all the viewers will know this, that even though the Kurds and the quote Iraqi army were on the same side, they had a lot of differences, and they didn't get along, as you've pointed out, with many things. As a matter of fact, as I understand it, the Iraqi army, the Arab Iraqi army, or that part of it, didn't want certain weapons that we were supplying to the Iraqi army to go to the Kurds. Is that true?
Yeah, we had no sniper rifles, we had no mortars, we had no RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades. So none of that was issued. Body armor was very difficult for us to get. In fact, the Americans had body armor, my 10 guys, but we could not get anything formally issued to us from Baghdad. It just wouldn't happen. So because the country's plan was to vector everything by, through, and with Baghdad. Well, Baghdad, that's precisely what Baghdad wanted, because they could throttle anything going on with the Kurds. So with 3,300 guys, we had no body armor for these guys. And at one point, we were trying to scrounge stuff wherever we could find it. They didn't have up-armored vehicles. They had Mitsubishi thin-skin pickup trucks that they had made into gun trucks. One of my majors happened to be away at a meeting in out at FOB Spiker, Forward Operating Base Spiker, near Tikrit. He calls me on the radio. He says, "Hey, sir, I'm over here. There's a big stash of old Vietnam-era flak jackets over here. Could we use them?" I'm like, "Hell yeah, we could use them. Throw them on a bird, get them out here." I think he ended up loading 400 flak jackets and getting them sent out. We gave those to the guys, but they're better than nothing. Eventually, we got 1 battalion set of body armor.
This is what you're describing is somewhat reminiscent to Vietnam, because in Vietnam, the Americans were supplying the weapons, supplying the money, but in the final analysis, the South Vietnamese authorities had to approve certain things going certain places, and a lot of it didn't get to the places it needed to go.
Absolutely.
And that sounds like what you're describing to the with the Kurds. Let me ask you about you were there for a year. What were your quarters? You lived with the Kurds. You stayed with the Kurds for that year. Is that correct?
We lived in a safe house that was on a Kurdish Farmandi, which is like a little military base, and it was a house. We had 10 guys in there. We had 10 interpreters. We were blessed with interpreters, by the way, for a small team. With 10 interpreters, we could literally, because the Kurds are not infiltrated by enemy, we could split up. We didn't have to go as a single 10-man team. We could split up on individual missions. One guy with Kurds and an interpreter. But we had a small kitchen, and we had a weight room in there, and we had a commo room with all our usual gear, as you can imagine. A couple of satellite dishes on the roof for classified comms. And the equipment we were issued as a team was everything was fresh out of the box. I've never in my 32 years in the Army been issued nothing but brand new stuff. The weapons, all the gear was stuff that was being purchased for Special Forces. We had all the best optics, best comms, redundant comms. We had it all, and I wasn't complaining. My up armored Humvee had 81 miles on the odometer when I drew it.
So you had very good equipment.
I was pleased with it.
Tremendous equipment. Now, what was your diet? Did you have Army rations, or did you eat with the? I assume you probably ate most of your meals with the Kurds.
I did, yes. I mean, that's a good way of building rapport. But to answer your question, we had American cooks. So to keep the building running, we had 3 cooks, and we had 3 commo guys and 3 mechanics who weren't necessarily the advisors, but because you're on a small team, you've got to cross-train everybody. And all of our guys, mechanics, commo guys, and cooks, they wanted to get on missions. And my cooks, for crying out loud, all 3 of them got combat action badges because they mixed it up with the enemy on some missions. So they loved it. But we would do a supply run every week to 10 days. A convoy would bring out chow for us. And that was always, great fun because we'd just take our shirts off, strip down, because you're going to be hauling food into the building, in the Iraqi heat. And it was enough for another week or so. And it was good. It was good. But I ate at least 2 meals a day with the Kurds because I was out with them all the time.
Well, tell us about the Kurds' diet. What did they eat, or what?
Well, I mean, a lot of lamb, a lot of rice, a lot of garbanzo beans, a lot of vegetables. They would, grill and stuff vegetables. Their stuffed vegetables they called yaprach or sometimes dolma. I think dolma is more the Arabic name for it. Lots of breads of different types, and
a lot of their foods were cooked over an open fire. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, even in the homes, they would have I guess it's sometimes called a tandoor. It's like a pit oven. The flames are inside, and the ladies would take the bread on a pad, flat bread, and they would stick it to the roof of the tandoor on the inside, exposed to the heat. And then they would peel it off, and you'd have warm bread.
That's probably very good.
It's excellent.
Now, didn't the shish kebab originate over in that area?
Shishks, yes.
Is that?
There's another version called tikka.
Same. What? Okay, I won't ask you about that. Okay. Even though as you've said, the Kurds are predominantly Muslim, understand that. Some of the Kurds had a taste for American bourbon. Is that correct, or is that just a rumor?
That's not a rumor. That's not a rumor. My my counterpart, he was a bit of a Kurdish war hero, certainly amongst the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan Fighters, and I lived with the PUK. So he had been wounded 8 times in battle when I met him.
8 times?
Yeah. I was with him in Tikrit when he got his 9th time. That was an assassination attempt on him from within the Iraqi army. We discovered a little bit later, but that's another story. But before notable missions, he would get his officers and senior leaders together, and we would have either a big celebratory meal or last supper, whatever you want to call it. But it was, yards of food. Every inch of the table was taken up with food, and every other inch was taken up with bottles of Jack Daniels and Tuborg and everything else you can imagine. And he knew he would do this to me. He would bust my chops every time we did this. And he would put some arak in front of me or something, or some whiskey or something. And he would say, "Have a drink, brother." And I would say, "Well, I can't." And he would say, "Well, why?" I said, "Because George Bush will fire me." And he said, "But he's not here, brother, and we won't tell him." I said, "No, you're just going to have to bear with me on this one."
Well, the next question, I'm pretty sure I know the answer to it because of what you said previously. But what was your opinion of the Kurds as a fighting force?
They were tenacious. My counterparts, especially the one I just mentioned to you, my main counterpart, they would frequently say, "We have the belief. We have the belief," and that was their reason for fighting, because they had something bigger than themselves they were fighting for. So, in terms of the will to fight, the will to stick with it, these guys had it. And I would rather have a unit with will than a unit with capability any day of the week, because I can deal with the lack of capability. We can work on that. But unless your unit has the will to fight, that's a tough nut to crack. So I'd written something in one of my after-action reports, and I meant it, and it may have even, I think I've included it in the book I'm working on. But basically it's this. It's relatively simple and easy to train an indigenous unit to do something like defend a central regime. But changing what they think is important, that's not so easy. You see, that gets back to their national narrative. How do they see themselves, right? How does this group you're with see themselves in the world? What is important to them? And my American counterparts, who frequently accuse us of going native, never understood this, I don't think, not enough. That if you're going to be embedded with these people, you have to be perceptive enough. You have to understand their narrative in order to understand what they think is important, to understand, i.e., what they will fight for. And so you've got to be perceptive enough to know, well, let me back up. You can't presume that any indigenous unit will share a unity of interest with the United States. We never can. But if you're perceptive enough to identify where those interests coincide, now you can move mountains. You can, absolutely. And I'd like to give you a perfect example of this. So for a long period of time, the pipeline from Kirkuk to Beji, the oil pipeline, was getting hit about 6 times a week. There were Iraqi units and some American units guarding the pipeline. Now, this pipeline. Now, the oil out of Kirkuk is underneath Kurdish soil, historically Kurdish soil, but successive regimes in Baghdad have been trying to ethnically cleanse that area of Kurds ever since. So it's become a mixed area. And that pipeline has been taking oil out of Kirkuk since it was discovered in 1924, 25, 26. Heading it down towards Baghdad. So the Kurds have never really been able to use their own oil. But anyway, this pipeline ran from Kirkuk to Beji, which is near Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and then down to Baghdad. But that was getting hit by various al-Qaeda elements 6 times a week, despite having Iraqi security forces on that pipeline. And this was another disagreement, let's say, or just discussion point between me and some of the leadership over there, who were agonizing with, how do we stop this hemorrhage of oil out of this pipeline? And I said, well, it's simple. The Iraqi security forces you have in the pipeline are infiltrated with the enemy. They're hitting the pipeline. Just put my Kurdish unit on there. This pipeline sabotage will end. And I was told, actually, he was even laughing. I won't put another Kurd with a rifle in Kirkuk. I said, but sir, it's not the Kurds who are hitting your pipeline. just put us on there, and that stuff's going to get cleaned up. Well, that was refused. But the 101st Airborne had to go back. They left. That unit left and went back to the United States. And I seem to recall that was maybe August. I am not kidding you. Within 24 hours of their departure, we had a Kurdish battalion on the pipeline. And the sabotage went straight down. The hits on the pipeline stopped immediately. So the enemy laid low for about 2 weeks trying to figure out this Kurdish presence on the pipeline. Then they tried a couple of attacks, which were repelled very easily. There's a big attack. Then our Kurds were able to monitor the local mosques. After that big one, there were 12 military-age funerals within the next 24 hours in surrounding towns, from which these Iraqi units were drawn. So I was back in my safe house a month later, and one of my interpreters comes running in from our day room. We had a TV and stuff in there. He runs in. He says, sir, come in. You got to see something. And he points to the TV. He goes, you know what they're saying? I said, I don't know what they're saying. That's why I have you. And he goes, well, they're talking about the Peshmerga on the pipeline, the Kurdish fighters. I said, well, what are they saying? He says, well, since it was an Iraqi TV station, or Iraqi media, it said, he said, well, since the Kurds have been on the pipeline, the oil has been flowing consistently for at least 30 days. We can't recall the last time the oil has flowed consistently for 30 days. We estimate this has saved Iraq $1 billion in previously lost oil.
Did they leave the Kurds on the pipeline?
We stayed on the pipeline after that.
I can imagine. You've got a book there, General. Tell us about the book. You've already said you've got the names, I think, of the Americans who were killed and the Americans who were wounded. Is that?
Well, we didn't lose any Americans from my team. This is Fulton Machine's.
I'm sorry, these soldiers that are the Kurdish soldiers.
Yeah, the Kurds I was with, yeah. So, I carried Fulton Sheen's wartime prayer book in my cargo pocket on my leg for the entire time I was there. And as we would lose somebody, sadly, I would write their names into the margins on this page here, which is Prayer for a Dying Comrade. And, there's 22 there. 22 names.
Now you also, I'm not sure we can show it, but you came today with an ISIS flag.
I did.
Tell us a story about that. How'd you end up with the ISIS flag?
Well, so when ISIS attacked in 2014, now this was after I had left active duty. So they surged into Iraq, and it was they arose from within ranks inside Iraq as well. There was a Kurdish group from Iran, and I'm very close to all the Kurdish groups, including the Kurdish resistance groups in Iran, well known to these guys. It's the Azadi Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the Freedom Party. And it's led by a general by the name of Hussein Yazdan Pana. And you'll see him online. People like to say he looks like Joseph Stalin. He does. He looks exactly like him. And he jokes about that. But anyway, so I had gone back to Iraq, and I was there, and he and his guys picked me up in Erbil, because I was one of the things I was going to do was go down to see his unit down on his battle position, which was near this long-time ISIS and Al-Qaeda snake pit called Hawija on the southwest side of Kirkuk. And he was there. So his unit, he brought his fighters into Iraq to help repel ISIS. And his unit had been in every major Kurdish operation against ISIS. And it's true, the ISIS flag has never flown on Kurdish-controlled soil. When ISIS arose in Iraq, when the Iraqi army collapsed and ran away, before Iran stepped in to prop them up formally, the Iraqi army ran away, the Kurds stepped forward. Kurds immediately established a 1,000-kilometer line against ISIS. So the black flag of ISIS has never flown on any Kurdish-controlled soil. So his unit, Hussein Yazdan Pana's unit, was in every major Kurdish operation in the main effort. So while we're at his battle position, he turned to one of his guys, and I remember him nodded to him. The guy walks into another part of the bunker, comes out, he's carrying this black thing. He hands it to me. I open up, it's the nicest flag. And he says, the previous owners won't be needing that anymore. It was captured up in Bashika, and that was up near Mosul. That was a bad part of town.
Now here we are in 2021. We're out of Iraq. We're out of Afghanistan. We're essentially out of the Middle East. What's happening with the Kurds these days, General?
Well, they still have achieved in Iraq really what we were hoping for the rest of Iraq. Sure, the Iranians have pressed in there and have begun to try to co-opt the Kurdish area as well. But the Kurds have been very resistant. They're absolutely resistant to jihadism. They have resisted jihad since the early Islamist proselytization in the Kurdish areas, at least back to early 60s. And they're very proud of that. So, and they're proud of their history of religious coexistence. Very proud of that.
So they're still independent. They're still not being ruled by the Iranians or by anybody else at the present time.
Well, I mean, they're still part of Iraq, and so they're part of a federal Iraq. They recognize that they are part of the federal Iraq, but they are an autonomous zone, an autonomous region in the north of Iraq. But since 2017, when the Iranians have stepped in, the Iranians have helped Baghdad, which is essentially Tehran West these days, establish tighter control on the Kurds. For example, when I was there, and the Kurds are very proud of this fact, there was no Iraqi army in all of Kurdistan. Because after Operation Northern Watch went in 91, pushed Saddam Hussein off their backs, there was no Iraqi army unless it was specifically approved by the Kurdish capital in Erbil, which was my unit, basically, because it was a Kurdish Peshmerga brigade, rebadged as Iraqi army. It was 100% Kurdish. The Kurds controlled their airport in Erbil. They controlled all their border crossings. They controlled most of the so-called Northern Oil Company, which was the Kurdish, which was the oil extraction going on in Kirkuk. But all of that's changed now. The Iranian proxies through Baghdad now they control the airport, they control the border crossings, they control the Northern Oil Company, and they control large portions of the so-called disputed territories, which were historically Kurdish.
Which brings me, General, to one of the last questions, and I ask all veterans this in some form or another. Looking back now, where the Americans are pretty much out of the Middle East, are part of it. What do you think looking back in retrospect, and of course hindsight's always 100%. What do you think the United States did right, or what do you think the United States did wrong in looking back now?
Well, let's use Central Europe and Asia as an example. We went there to fight and win wars, right? That's what our military does. That's why we have an army, to fight and win our wars. And the basic recipe it's pretty simple, and it's been this way since Christ was a corporal, and that's by killing people and breaking stuff. I mean, I hate to be so frank, but that's the reality of combat. And after we won our wars in Central Europe, in Asia, and on the Korean Peninsula, what did we do? We stayed. We didn't stay because we wanted to occupy these countries for our selfish gain. We stayed because we needed to deter future adversaries. Because just as nature abhors a vacuum, so does foreign policy and national security. We stayed. We won those wars and we stayed. And there were very few people who were clamoring to get us home. I wonder why that's the case, why that's not the case today. But for whatever reason, in December 2011, President Obama withdrew all U.S. forces from Iraq. And what happened immediately? Iran surged in and became the dominant power in the Persian Gulf, period, exclamation point. And now, then, with the threat, this rising threat of Iran, which was trying to establish a Shia crescent from Tehran through Baghdad, all the way through Syria, to the shores of the Mediterranean. In the face of that, is it any surprise that the Sunni populace was worried about that? And the conditions were ripe for a Sunni jihadi resurgence, and that's what we saw precisely when ISIS burst onto the scene.
Well, I know you're writing a book about your experience, and I'm not sure when do you think it's going to come out, General?
People ask that question. Well, I'm 90% done, but every time I say that, I think of something else on the book. So,
well, hopefully sometime in the next few years we'll get a chance to read your book. And I want to thank you for taking the time and explaining. I'm sure a lot of the viewers and myself gained a lot of knowledge about the Kurds and their place in the Middle East. And I can tell, and I'm sure all the viewers can tell, the admiration and respect that you have for the Kurds, General. And in addition to that, I want to again thank you for your service to the country. Thank you for your 30-some years. I think it's 30-some years.
32. Yeah,
32 years of service. And thank you for coming down today and telling the story of the Kurds.
Well, Frank, no, thank you for the opportunity. And, let me cover just one other quick one about the Kurds. So they have, they're Peshmerga. They have female fighters. You've probably seen,
yes.
Seen some of them on TV, certainly during the Syrian operations. Well, one day my counterpart calls me over there and he says, he wanted to take me over to the Jaf tribe, the Kurdish Jaf tribe, which was a very old, very well-known Kurdish tribe. And in its heyday, at the end of the 19th century, early, mid-19th century, they could field 4,000 armed horsemen. And some of my interpreters were Jafs. Some of the guys I served with were Jafs. I knew them very well. And he wanted to go, the Jafs were having some tribal gathering. He wanted me to go. So I went, and it was fantastic. They had their horses out, and they had their dancers out, and they had everything. And just a huge crowd out in an open field, in a rolling field. Walking through the crowd, and I see this older Kurdish lady. And she's seated regally on this plastic chair, like at a picnic, And the first thing I notice is her dress, and the Kurdish ladies will wear incredibly colorful dresses. I don't think you'll see this anywhere else in the Middle East. They're traditional dresses. Very metallic and shimmery and incredible. And they go on picnics with these things. It's amazing. But anyway, first thing I noticed was this lady. She was wearing a dress made up of small Kurdish flags. Well, that wouldn't sell. That wouldn't be too conducive for continued good health if she was in Turkey wearing a dress of Kurdish flags. But anyway, she's wearing it. She's very proud of it. Then I noticed on her head she was wearing a mishki, which Kurds of either sex, if you're wearing a mishki, you're considered a Kurd of great respect. So I knew she had to be a respected older lady. But what really kind of stopped my breath was when I noticed she was carrying an AK-47. So she's just sitting there like this. She's got this weapon in her shoulder, just like that. I walked up to her, I said, "Pure, auntie," term of respect. "Pure, what's with the Kalashnikov?" And without batting an eye, she said, "I was a Peshmerga for 13 years. I came back to my village. My family had been killed. This Kalashnikov is my best friend. I will be buried with it."
No kidding.
Tough lady.
That is certainly that's certainly a tough lady. You're right. Well, again, General, thank you very much for
Thanks, Frank.
coming here. We
God bless
appreciate
you.
it very much.
Thanks for
you.
your service.
Thank
too.
you. This is a project that's authorized by Congress and administered by the Library of Congress. The objective is to record as many as possible of those veteran stories from World War II to the present. The library archives these videos and makes them available to the public in person and online. The library also encourages local venues such as historical societies and museums, like the one we're in today, the New Smyrna Museum of History, to keep these and make them available to the local population.